Can you give me your name and your occupation, please?
Matt Roller, assistant editor, ESPNcricinfo.
All right, I have invited you on because you're one of the few people, a bit like me, who's obsessed with every team, and you were sent out there with Crick Info to look at the entire tournament. You got there just at the end of round one, where Simon Wilde got you a positive test, so then you had to go into quarantine almost straight away. You and Wigmore, I think there was a few others that went into quarantine, so probably Freddie, I suppose. From we're going to skip round one only because you got there late, and those teams I'll talk about a separate time. But what I have done and what I've told you very, very briefly, and you're going to learn on this podcast, is I've ranked these teams like in a power list of how I think they went in this tournament. And I've put down a couple of things here about each team. And we're just going to go through all the teams from worst to best. So I'm going to start with Bangladesh. I put them last. I put them under Scotland, which will infuriate some Bangladesh fans. But actually, considering all the feedback I've had, probably make a lot of Bangladesh fans very happy. My big thing with them is, like, if they couldn't do it in this tournament in these conditions, which are the most Bangladesh-like conditions they're going to play a tournament unless they get another one at home, which they never will again. When are they ever going to be any good?
Yeah, and not least given the fact that Tamim didn't play because he didn't really fancy it, and the fact that Shakib is not going to be around forever. And as we saw in the last two games, losing Shakib is not like losing most players because he bats 3 or 4 and bowls 4 overs every game. Quite often in the power play, he'll bowl 1 or maybe even 2, and quite often he'll bowl 1 at the death as well. So it's like, yeah, losing Shakib is like losing 2 players at once, and they're probably going to lose him in a couple of T20 World Cups time. And yeah, it doesn't look great, does it? I was hugely disappointed with Bangladesh, to be honest. I thought they would be all right. I don't know whether that's sort of getting too sucked into their results in bilateral series, because obviously they do play in pretty extreme conditions at home. I mean, that Australia series, probably the best example of it. But looking at their attack, I thought Taskin Ahmed looked pretty good in the first couple of games in round one, especially. We've seen what the Fizz can do in IPLs for a number of years now. They seem to have something in terms of a well enough rounded attack that you could see them restricting teams okay, and then possibly enough experience in the batting lineup, possibly enough decent young players coming through that they could, win a couple of games, maybe give a couple of big teams a bloody nose in the Super 12s. But yeah, they were just absolutely terrible, weren't they?
Well, I mean, you talked about the Fizz. So
Yeah.
he had a terrible tournament after a very good IPL. I thought he was even better in the second half of the IPL than the first half. I wonder if that's just his shoulder again playing up from being overworked because he had to play in them back to back. But he was disappointing. I thought Taskin Ahmed was still good. But the thing is that they had nothing to defend. Right, because they lost the toss a lot as well. Although eventually it didn't really matter because they were getting bowled out for 84 every game or whatever it was. But they had nothing to defend. I think the Sri Lanka game's the only game where I thought they put on a total where I wouldn't say their bowlers let them down. I think they got a bit confused with their tactics when I don't think they expected any of the Sri Lankan middle orders to be any good, and then suddenly they got completely hosed by them. But they just didn't. They couldn't make runs. All the way through the tournament, realistically. And, that's how Scotland knocked them off as well. And, their bowling, as you said, was good, but not that good. But you take Shakib out of that team, as you said before. I wrote this, and people were like, well, look, they weren't doing any better, beforehand. I was like, there is no replacement for Shakib, right?
Yeah,
I'm in this
it's
perennial
brutal.
argument on TikTok with people about Australian all-rounders, and they're like, James Faulkner's an all-rounder, and Glenn Maxwell's an all-rounder, and Mitchell Marsh. I'm like, no, Shakib is a genuine all-rounder. Everyone else is a batter who can chip in with a couple of overs, or a bowler who can hit, right? Shakib is the genuine article. And I suppose the other thing is, you talked about the home conditions there. My worry now is, are their home conditions so turgid and weird, and I'm not just talking about the games that we see, but all the way through, there's something about the clay content in Bangladesh which seems so different to the rest of Asia, let alone, the rest of the world. I wonder if you can actually just stand upright and ping the ball. Like, do you have that confidence? Because all of their batters just look absolutely terrified to take any risks at all.
Yeah, well, I actually thought it was really interesting. He only sort of touched upon it, but Shane Watson, who was great on commentary, by the way, throughout the comp.
Tournament, the best commentator in the tournament. Who had him being better than Dale Steyn by that? Dale Steyn just said nicknames, and Shane Watson just came in with like a notebook of information every stint. It was incredible. Sorry.
Yeah, it was amazing. Well, actually, in game one, Watson was talking about the fact that Australia hadn't brought up short mid wicket when South Africa were like 50 for 4 after 8 overs, and was criticising Finch. And I thought this is just amazing insight. Anyway, Watson was basically saying in this Bangladesh game that there was a season, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago now, where he didn't bother with the Big Bash because he could earn a bit more money in the Bangladesh Premier League. And he was saying he was going over there and thought that there was no harder T20 competition to succeed in as an overseas batter because of how extreme the conditions are. And I was sort of thinking a bit about that and thinking, well, if these guys are only playing on these pitches, that can't be useful for your development when you're then playing against fast bowlers. And also because Bangladesh don't get the opportunities to play, they don't play a 5-match series away in Australia or England. I don't think their batters have that opportunity to do that. And they also don't really get franchise gigs, because if you think of like a team like West Indies or Pakistan, their batters might get an overseas contract to play in like the Blast or the PSL or CPL or maybe the Big Bash, whereas Bangladesh batters just don't really. So they play a huge percentage of their cricket at home on pitches that, really aren't good preparation to face fast bowlers. And looking ahead to next year's World Cup, they have a year to suddenly become much better players of fast bowling on tough pitches, and I think they go straight into the Super 12s again, and you can definitely see them losing every game again on current form. They look really terrible throughout that comp, I thought, and interested to see who keeps their place or whatever it looks like. I think they picked a squad today, and Mushfiqur's already been dropped, and I don't really think that's a particularly good necessarily a good move in the long term, but
so when I did the data on their team, so it was incredible. Like I did a scatter plot of it, but I can't remember. It must have been by average by strike rate in the BPL, and all the guys who had a good strike rate were international, and he was the only player. I had a cut off. I can't remember what the strike rate was. 130. He was the only international player. The only domestic player other than Mashrafi might have been there, but with an average of like 12 or something. Right? They're the only two about on the other side. Like when overseas players go there, they do it. So to drop him, that would seem to be. And I don't think. But this is the thing: if I was a franchise, I would never hire him. There's nothing in his T20 game that says anything. And there's basically, other than Shakib and the Fizz, there's no one really there that you're like, you would be that interested in. All right, we've done the poor Bangladesh team. That's Matt Roller, if you want to follow him on Twitter, Bangladesh fans. I was the one saying all the nice things there. Scotland. I find Scotland was quite interesting because, as someone who's worked for them, their batting is really what dominates at the lower level, and their bowling is very good, and sometimes, even better than that. They almost flipped the script. I really don't think they batted particularly well in this tournament, but I thought their bowlers overcompensated for that.
Yeah, they were quite interesting. Well, it's funny you say that as well, because I think the guy that I had highest expectations of out of Scotland's attack coming into this tournament was arguably the guy who underperformed the most, which was Brad Wheel. He had a great.
You're right.
He had a great blast season and then had a good 100 season. He was the only guy in London Spirit who played at all well, who sort of increased his reputation over that comp, and he had actually a pretty poor comp.
He might have. I haven't looked at the numbers, but I think he might have had the statistically worst. Of the full-time bowlers in this tournament, I think he might have ended up being the worst when it comes to economy. And it's like, as you said, he came out of that. Scotland have huge high hopes for him as well.
Yeah.
And he couldn't get it together, could he?
Yeah, I sort of don't think it's a long-term thing with him. No. But one thing that's interesting when you talk about like the discrepancy there, I think the fact we have to, when we're talking about like the associate teams in this tournament, I think you have to consider all the long-term stuff. So firstly, the fact that these guys aren't really used to being in a bubble, and Scotland, by the end of that comp, they played 3 games in 5 or 6 days right at the end. And I think they've been in a bubble for like 8 or 9 weeks by the end of that, because they played a huge heap of games in the Gulf beforehand. So that's one long-term factor. And then the other is the fact that most of their players who were centrally contracted, at least, were on furlough last year. So, the government were paying their wages and they weren't allowed to play cricket. And I think more of their bowlers have county contracts. So Wheel and Josh Davey, Sharif has played a bit of county cricket last summer. So might have played into it a little bit. I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching and looking for an explanation when there's not one there. But
I mean, Munsey played Blast for Kent, didn't he? I thought he did okay. Look, I mean, I don't think it's the end of the world. My bigger worry with their batting is that it's quite old. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's going to be a problem for the next tournament, but where they go, like they really need to find someone in that top 4 or top 5 who's, who can make runs consistently at the pace that they have been, because I do think that is their core. But the professionalism thing, I think, is so important. Like the fact that they just weren't being able to work on their games. I mean, I got messages from a couple of boys last year just going, if you hear of any small franchise jobs out there, let us know. And, that just because they needed to hit the ball, right? It's they weren't saying, usually it's, can you get me into a really good league because I want to play in that league. This time it was like, literally, if there's a stupid league that you know of that has a spot, I just want to go and play. I think that's the thing. Kyle's comments at the press conference, I can't remember which one, but it was towards the end of the tournament. I think that he really wants to professionalize Scottish cricket, and it's still kept back in the, as a former employee, I could say this. I still think there's a real amateur part of Scottish cricket. Although I will say this, I think they seem to have the biggest support staff of any associate team. There was like when we were at the qualifiers, there was about 3 of us. Suddenly there's about 20 people there. But I do feel that there's a real amateur feel still to Scottish cricket, and I think that comes from the lower levels. I don't think it's the players or anything, or even the administration. But I remember a similar thing happened with Hong Kong, where the better Hong Kong got, the more that like the Hong Kong people who ran Hong Kong cricket were a little bit like, yeah, but we won't be able to use the nets as much now. And I'm not saying it's quite like that in Scottish cricket, but I do get the feeling that they like the amateur side of cricket, whereas that's going to keep Scotland from becoming the next Ireland or Afghanistan, really.
Yeah, I just sort of looking through their squad in that tournament. I think you mentioned Munsey. I think maybe one of the other things with associates is maybe 10 years ago, a team wouldn't have seen Munsey bat when they're coming up against him. So you suddenly open the bowling to Munsey, you kind of guess what he's good at.
Yeah.
And then after he plays 4 reverse sweeps in the first over, you go, oh, right, maybe we should have a guy back on the reverse sweep. Whereas what you saw right from the beginning in this World Cup is that teams have lost that competitive advantage because their games are streamed. Analysts sort of bother to put the hours in before they play against a team like Scotland. So instantly, I think Pakistan, he played some pretty horrible innings. It was like 19 off 30 or something like that. But immediately they had guys out behind square, both sides of the wicket, completely choking off his strong zone. So he was having to adapt against a really good bowling attack and found it really tough. And I think Kurtz has said as well, just, these guys a lot of them do actually have pretty good records against playing like top quality spin. So someone like Callum McLeod played a pretty famous innings against Rashid Khan I think 3 or 4 years ago. But when you sort of factor in the lack of high level preparation in the probably year or 18 months leading into the comp, plus the fact that the pitches were pretty low for the most part, especially in their sort of Sharjah games, they found it really, really tough. So sort of before their game against Afghanistan, which was their first Super 12s game, I was thinking, these guys have a track record of doing okay against against bowlers like Majib and Rashid. They could be okay. And they really found it tough because the ball didn't bounce. And that sort of, you can negotiate probably one of the two, but the combination of low bounce and that quality spin, they really struggled against. And I don't know. I think they're gonna have to stick with the same core because there isn't a very big player pool. Maybe Kurtz will probably have to retire at some point in the next few years, but interested to see where they go next. We should also obviously mention Mark Watt. He was arguably my favorite bowler of the comp at some point because he is so incredibly defensive, but was unbelievably good at that job for the first 3 Super 12 games and all of the qualifying games, and just barely went to run a ball. And has so much variation for someone who bowls the bowling style that lends itself to the fewest variations possible, if that makes sense. You literally slow left armers, almost everyone just has one ball. Some of them turn, some of them don't. And he uses the crease so well. He changes his pace so much. He changes his release points. For the most part, it went really well. It sort of got hit a couple of times towards the end where people suddenly were waiting for that 25-yarder that he bowls from in line with the umpire. But amazing exposure for him as well. And I think he's playing like T10 off the back of it, and hopefully he gets a few more contracts and stuff like that, and can develop in a way that it's quite difficult to as a player from a country that doesn't play enough international cricket.
I think I've been a big fan of him for a long time. I will say that I don't think he bowled a left arm wrist spin in this tournament, so he's actually got even more variation for a guy with like literally almost no variation. All right, Namibia. So let's start with the political part of this. That Picky, oh God, I've forgotten his name. Picky France, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Picky France played 4 games, bowled 4 overs. I think faced 9 balls, 11 balls in the tournament. That's not good enough from Namibia. I actually think I saw him bowl in the qualifiers. I think he's a good off spinner. So I think part of it might have been matchups at times, but they did. There's no point having him in the side and him not bowling or batting. That's not helping anyone. But that all comes from the fact that Namibia is basically 4 cricket clubs who are representing a very new nation, I suppose, in many ways.
Yeah, I think so Ferdo's Munda from Cricinfo did a good interview with Gerhard Erasmus
Yeah.
and a few other senior players in the squad, and they were sort of talking about the fact that it's such a small sport in Namibia. It's almost like polo is in the UK or something like that. It's just so inherently posh. It's so small. There are 5 pitches. There are 18 players to choose from. So despite the fact that it's hugely unrepresentative, that squad. I think that Picky France and then Ben Shikongo, I think he's called, played 1 game as well.
They used to have.
I think they were the 2 black guys in the squad, but
yeah, they had another player. Is his name Shivago, who I think retired during COVID as well. And obviously Zane Green, is. I think Zane Green might be mixed race. I'm not sure what his actual ethnicity is, but look, we understand why. But then picking Picky and not actually allowing him to bowl was a bad sign. I think that if they are, they're going to come back in the next tournament. They've got to find, or they're going to find anyone new players. They've got to develop their top order players to be able to score at more than a run a ball. I'm not saying they're going to have to score at a strike rate 140, but it's got to be more than a run a ball, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, they had a really unusual setup. We see almost every smaller T20 team, if you have a handful of good batters, they will move to the top 3 to face as many balls as possible. Whereas Namibia kind of locked in this idea that they were going to have the bomb squad, as they called it. So Erasmus, JJ Smith, and Visa at 4, 5, and 6, which is pretty unusual. And I don't know, kind of worked. Smith had a pretty horrible comp, and Erasmus obviously had a broken finger, so it's hard to read too much into his batting. Visa was really good. I don't know. I don't want to write that off as an idea just based on a pretty short tournament. But no, you're right. There were definitely some pretty turgid power plays with the bat where they were sort of 25 for 1 and stuff like that, and you sort of wonder how they'd managed to get to that point. But
I could be wrong, but I think they had 3 players with a strike rate over a run a ball by the end of the tournament.
Yeah, that sounds right.
When I looked at it, because I felt they'd been better than that, but part of that was because their bowling had been quite good. But there was also the game they beat Scotland. That was about the worst possible chase. And I can see, again, they're starting slow, keeping wickets in hand so that the guys would smash it at the end. But, geez, they made an absolute certain victory into, they just got over the line in the end. So I think that's the negatives from them. But hopefully, the fact that they did have some good games, I'm sure they got good press back home. It's not going to. I don't think it's going to change anything in the next World Cup or the World Cup afterwards, if they qualify for that one. But if you look at what happened with Ireland in 2007, we know that there is then a generation who at least turn on the TV and go, "Oh, this is a sport, I can play this." And that has to be the next step in Namibia, because they can't keep picking from, as you said, 18 or 20 players.
Yeah, and they do actually have quite a similar situation to Ireland in a way, in that a lot of their players do get to play South African domestic cricket, or they play against South African domestic teams a lot of the time themselves, which does sort of lend itself to improvement, more opportunities, all that sort of thing, and is clearly a massive factor. And even if they can sort of, there's a few South African born guys in their squad. I think Ruben Trumpelman is South African but sort of adopted Namibian. So if they can, I don't want to use the word poach, but if they can do some cherry pick a few guys,
some Scottish
or whatever,
passport hunting, Scotland or the Netherlands passport hunting. Oh, so your grandmother once happened to be bored here. That sort of stuff. I think you could certainly do that. Okay, West Indies. So I thought West Indies were a legitimate chance to win the whole thing, and they're lucky to be ahead of Namibia on my list. I think. I mean, they were putrid by the end of that last game. Was embarrassing the way that it just became a beer game against Australia. They don't have time to rebuild before the next World Cup, but I don't think they have to because I think they've got a lot of very good young players out there. My biggest thing for them is that their bowling attack is nowhere near the levels that it was in 2012, even 2014 or 2016.
Yeah, I think that is actually a massive factor as well, that probably got underplayed a little bit in the analysis of why they went out, because they had such a weird comp because, the 55 all out against England is, Pollard said afterwards, it was a game that you basically have to bin and move on, which I think is probably the right thing. It's what West Indies have always done. They've always had a high variance approach. That happens when you're a team that tries to hit a load of sixes. There will be times where every attempt at a six happens to find long on, and you kind of just have to hold up your hands and say that's fine. And then in the second game, they had, you probably shouldn't have selected Lendl Simmons in the first place, but he played one of the all-time worst T20 innings.
I reckon. So I'm not to defend him at all because it was what you just said it was, but I think they were so petrified about what had happened in the game before that they literally told him to bat through the innings, and then he just got stuck, right?
Yeah.
And he couldn't get out of it. So I don't think it was like, I think a lot of people were thinking that he just wasn't up to it. But I think what happened was he tried to get to 20 balls, make sure that they got through the innings, and then he had no backlift. He was trying to hit the ball at the end with no backlift. It was like watching. It was like watching someone in club cricket, the old guy, the 55-year-old, and he gets to the point where it's like, oh, we got to score it, a run a ball to win this game. It's like, I don't know how to score it, run a ball. That's what Lendl Simmons looked like at the end. But yeah, I mean, that was bizarre. I would say their batting is less of a worry in that, you've got Evan Lewis, you've got Fabian Allen, you got Pooran, you got Hetmeyer. There's plenty, not to mention guys like, Powell and Rutherford and outside the squad. I can see how they could stock that back up pretty quick. They're still going to have Pollard for the next tournament, aren't they? So absolutely not too worried about that. I doubt that they're going to have another tournament where they bat that bad, would be my guess. But how do they get better with the ball?
It's tough, isn't it? I think, firstly, they seem to pick quite a defensive attack, I think. So if you look at the guys that they could have picked, I think it was a big loss, actually, and probably an underrated loss, was Obed McCoy, because people are talking about him as a sort of next big talent. But they didn't give a single game to O'Shane Thomas, who was bowling 150 Ks in the last CPL. I don't know whether, maybe that was just a speed gun thing and you get suckered in, but he's a genuine attacking option with a new ball, bowls high pace, which was pretty effective throughout the World Cup for the most part. I think it was an opportunity missed that you don't give someone like him a game when you're giving games to a 37, I want to say, year old Ravi Rampal. And generally, I think their attack was pretty defensive throughout the time they were successful. So I think in 2012 to 2016, with the exception of maybe Narayan, who you could say at that point was an attacking bowler, most of them were sort of guys that would contain and take their wickets through scoring pressure rather than genuine attacking bowlers. Whereas I think now people have been talking about West Indies struggling because the game has been evolving. I think one of the ways that the game has evolved since 2014, 2016 is that you need more genuine attacking options in your attack. And if you look at the attack they were ending with, which was Rampal, Bravo, Pollard and Russell sharing overs because they had to, Akil Hossain, who's pretty good, but again, pretty defensive. Guys like that. I think Jason Holder as well towards the end. There are a lot of guys who are sort of extremely solid, economical to some extent, guys who are bowling 80 miles an hour. But in terms of a point of difference, a leg spinner, a genuine fast bowler, they really didn't have one of those throughout most of that competition. And I'm not sure that you can get away with that in the way that you once could, because rather than sort of soaking up dots, teams are generally playing with higher intent. Teams are generally seeing the batting lineup West Indies have and thinking we can't just get par, we need to get slightly above par, but we have an opportunity to do that because we can set ourselves and these guys don't have the pace to trouble us. So yeah, I think it's a massive change. You look at the quality of the spin attack when you even compared to, obviously Narayan didn't play in 2016, but Suleiman Ben and Samuel Badger in 2016 versus, maybe Hossain will go on to be a really good bowler, but him and Hayden Walsh this time around, it's a huge drop off. And yeah, with the bat, I think it's tricky. I definitely don't think that this tournament invalidates West Indies' approach and that you shouldn't try and hit sixes. I think that the combination of the age profile of this West Indies squad, where you have very few players in the sort of peak years between, say, 26, 32. I think you basically had Lewis, Holder, and then a couple of guys who don't play much T20 like Ross and Chase of that age profile. Everyone was either still pretty young or probably a little bit too old. When you consider that, yeah, I don't know. I think, and when you consider the conditions where UAE generally is somewhere where it's not the end of the world if you're a team that hits more fours than sixes, whereas in 2016 in India, you're playing on a lot of small ground, so hitting sixes was more important than hitting fours. It basically was a cocktail where you can see why West Indies completely bombed, which was, they had an old squad, the conditions didn't suit them, and they happened to have a few really bad games. And if you have one terrible team performance with the bat and one terrible individual performance with the bat in your first two games against England and South Africa, the format basically means that you're pretty much knocked out solely as a result of that.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I also think that in not picking Jason Holder, there's a lot of nonsense coming out of the West Indies that Jason Holder was not in the side, but Ravi Rampal was, and it's like, well, they're not the same player. And realistically, I think if Obed had been fit, fun Obed McCoy fact, I got him his agent, but we'll talk about that later. I think if he'd been fit, he would have played through. He would have taken over that role and would be a more attacking option and is as good a death bowler, maybe even a better death bowler. I think they didn't quite. If they picked Holder, right, they could have gone into every team with, let's say, Bravo, Holder listed at 8 and Bravo listed at 9. They could have even then put Hayden Walsh listed at 10 or something, right? And just be like, we're going to do this. They kind of felt like they were halfway between those two thinkings. Like having Lendl Simmons at the front tells me they were a little bit worried about losing wickets. Having Ravi Rampal tells me they were a little bit worried about, the quality of their all-round bowlers. And that might also be that Andre Russell and Dwayne Bravo are no longer at their best. I mean, that's why Bravo is retiring. He's still a very good player, but he doesn't play every game for Chennai anymore. And Andre Russell is not the bowler he used to be just because he can't do that. And he's an attacking option as well. So they lost that as well. So I think I think they just couldn't quite work out which direction they wanted to go. But it's really interesting to see what they do because, as I said, I don't think they're as bad. I mean, I think they were absolutely as bad as I've ranked them in this list, but I don't think they're that bad when you go when you look going forward. All right, Afghanistan. I think we all got a bit excited, Matt, with Afghanistan after a couple of games. I still think though that they should have beaten Pakistan. My excitement was more on the Pakistan game than anything else. But let's be honest here. They do not have top order players who can average 30 with a strike rate of 130. They're pace bowlers. They literally had to, unfreeze Hamid Hassan. And they have the best spin attack in the world, but they also don't kind of back it, if that makes sense. Like, they could have gone into this game with, or they could have gone into this tournament and just gone, well, here's two leg spinners, here's Majib, here's Nabi, and here's, what's his name? Waqar Salim Keel or Zahir Khan. They could have gone all in. They didn't even do that. It ended up a lot of right arm medium pace that, people could hit.
Yeah, they didn't even pick Case Ahmed, which I thought was one of the worst selection calls of the World Cup. The fact he didn't even get in the squad,
yeah,
but
that's what I mean. Like they had even if they could have doubled down on that, and they didn't. And I was watching them by the end of the tournament, going, "We've got a bunch of guys who can bowl 130 k's an hour. This looks like an associate team now."
Yeah, and also it's probably even more of a missed opportunity, given that the next World Cup is in Australia, where you would generally think that. Obviously Brisbane can do incredibly well in Australia in T20s, but the fact that they don't have a genuine quick bowler is probably going to cost them more in that competition than it is than it would have in this one. So I think, maybe they should have just gone all in on. They kind of went all in on their batting strategy of just we're going to hit and keep hitting, because obviously that Pakistan game probably summed it up. I can't remember exactly what they were off the power play, but something like 45 for 4, but just kept going. They did have a tiny bit of consolidation, but it was still a pretty attacking partnership, even when they weren't scoring quickly. It was just the fact they kept hitting infielders. I agree. I think maybe people did get a bit too excited. I think a few of the guys that I think you look at their top three of Zazai, Shazad, and Gurbaz, and I don't think any of them got 100 runs, which I think it's pretty unexpected, really. I think Zazai has kind of been found out as having one or two shots. Shazad is obviously relatively old. Gurbaz was disappointing given how promising he is, but he is only 19, or he's very young at least. And
he's only a certain age.
Najibullah was really good in the middle order, but too often coming in at a point where there was no kind of platform for him to go from. So
it was him and Nabi really who were the best bats.
Yeah.
And look, I've got no problem with Nabi. I mean, chances are he'll be saving them in the next tournament. But I think either Gabaz needs to get better. You know, I'm not saying he can't do this, because I think he has the ability to hit with a batting brain. But I think they need one guy in the top three who can, I don't know, score 40 runs, 35 runs consistently at a good strike rate. And then the rest of their tactic is, I'm okay with it at that point. And it's just finding that combination, because on the tougher batting pitches, right, you need someone who has the other batting skills. And I don't know if they're ever going to have like a Steve Smith type player, or, those sorts of players that they can drop in. But if they can have at least one person to be able to do that, I've got no problem with everyone else just trying to hit sixes around them. But there were too many times where I thought, oh my God, all you need now is someone to just chip it around for like 4 overs, 2 overs. And they never had that player. Very interesting.
Well, maybe they did for like 2 games when Asghar Afghan was still pre-retirement.
I was thinking that,
because he was kind of doing that in that team, right?
Yeah.
When he was meant to be, at least, and then decided that he didn't fancy it. He once he'd played that game against Namibia and Abu Dhabi in front of 10 people, he decided that was the pinnacle and he had to go.
His retirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, the 2019 World Cup. They fell apart as a team behind the scenes, like completely. It seems like this time, other than retiring one of their most respected players, they kind of kept it together a little bit. The problem is, like, I've talked to a lot of people in Afghanistan cricket about this. The Afghanistan team doesn't have a lot of pressure on it in between tournaments, right? Because they don't play against India and Australia and England, and they play Ireland and they do okay, and they might lose to Zimbabwe or something, but there's no huge amounts of disgust from the government. They go to a World Cup, and every single person with political connections suddenly comes out of the woodwork, and it causes them. I think it causes them stress, and they overreact to little things. And look, it's not good. All right, Sri Lanka. So I wonder if the next tournament is too soon for them, and they clearly need a single death bowler, which is funny, being that Malinga was their guy for so long. But their middle order looks remarkable, and I would assume that middle order translates quite well to Australia, because still in Australia you're going to have a lot of spin bowled in those middle overs. I've got them better than Afghanistan and worse than South Africa. That's about right, isn't it? But they could make a play for the finals next time.
Yeah, I think so. I think I said at the time that it was a shame for them that the next comp is in Australia, because I think if it had been in the subcontinent, you don't want to make too many stereotypical assumptions about their batters, but I think in general they are better against Sri Lanka have really struggled against good leg spin over the past 5 years, but generally I think it's not necessarily going to play to their batting lineup strengths to be playing on fast bouncy pitches. If that's what is served up in Australia, I'm kind of assuming that it will be. But yeah, so earlier this year, so in, what was it, end of June, I think. So, 5 months ago, Sri Lanka came over to England and played a 3-match T20 series and a 3-match ODI series. And it was actually pretty embarrassing for the most part.
Not all their players played in it. Let's remember, some of them were sent home.
That's true. But, obviously they had this gaping hole that basically Mickey Arthur after the series said, we lost numbers 1, 2, and 4. Which was Gunatilaka, Dickwella, and Mendes. What are you meant to do in that situation? And they were absolutely abject. I remember the last game of the T20 series was at the Ageas Bowl. The first 2 have been in Cardiff, which, those aren't really grounds that are going to suit them, either of them. But at the Ageas Bowl, I think England bowled the first 16 overs. They basically decided they were just going to experiment in game as one of those things that England do. So they just bowled all seam for the first 16 overs, and then brought Rashid and Moen on for an over each at the end at 100 for 7, chasing 170 or something like that. It was like a real sort of, they looked a complete rabble. So then to turn up and do as well as they did, especially when you sort of look at the context of, so there was a point in the first game they played in the Super 12s, which was against Bangladesh in Sharjah, where I think they conceded 170 and were 4 down in the middle overs, kind of slightly behind the rate. Then Mawadullah gives them the 2 free overs of part-time off-spin, which, obviously they needed to score quickly, but you could very easily think, let's just try and take 8 from this over. Let's hit 1 boundary off each of these overs. Let's settle in. Let's build a partnership. And instead, Asalanka and Rajapaksa, I think it was, just absolutely took it to pieces, took 31 from those 2 overs. They win that game, and that kind of seems to, I don't know. I don't necessarily believe in lifting the belief across the camp or whatever, but I think it you look at the way their tournament could have gone if they'd been beaten quite badly by Bangladesh and Sharjah in their first game versus how it ended up going, which was sort of, one of the tournament's most exciting young teams, I guess.
Yeah, I think,
and that was,
I think it's probably fair to say that there was still a lot of flaws on show, but
yeah,
after that, at least it felt like they were in every game. They had a moment, and so if you look at it, their new ball bowling is very good. Their middle overs bowling is quite good. Their middle overs batting is quite good. Their death batting worries me a little bit going forward. And their top order, I think they'll be able to find top order players who may not be spectacular, will be able to do enough. There's something there, and they will come into it with another tournament of the Sri Lankan. No, is it the Lankan Premier League? Sri Lanka Premier League is very dead.
Yeah, and if you look at some of their players as well, like Avishka Fernando was sort of meant to be the number 4 and barely scored a run.
Yeah.
But even still, they managed to succeed around that. They, arguably should have beaten England in that game in Sharjah, given all the circumstances. Obviously, Butler played an unbelievable innings, but they didn't bowl very well in the second half of that innings. And then with the bat, when you consider sort of Mills pulling up and England kind of getting their sums a little bit wrong and having to bowl spin at the death when it was probably the dewiest night of the whole tournament, they probably should have won that game. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe in a couple of years when they have a bit more experience, they find a way to win that game. But yeah, I think all told, when you look at where they were even 5 or 6 months ago as a T20 team, to have competed as well as they did, to have had the leading wicket taker in the comp as well, and Hasaranga obviously played a lot of games, but that was pretty great. And the fact that they have 90-mile-an-hour bowlers again, where you look at a team like Afghanistan, what they would give to have someone like Chamira or Kumara in their team, that would be huge.
Hasaranga plays on a team that makes the semi-finals. He probably steals the Player of the Tournament award, doesn't he? Not even steals it. I mean, you could argue that he probably was the Player of the Tournament anyway. Yeah. But they were obviously going to give it to Warner or Zampa by the end. South Africa. Now, I didn't know where to put South Africa in this list because their record looks great, 4-1, right? And I don't think they're that good, even slightly. Let me go through. I think they should have lost the game to Sri Lanka. Had Sri Lanka had any more sense, Sri Lanka win that game easily. And I think that England took that last game off because once they qualified, they kept the score to within a reasonable amount, and they didn't get it. That would have meant that South Africa would have had a 2-3 record, right? Now, I'm not even if it's 3-2, they don't bat very fast at the top, and they have a lot of bowlers who can't bat. I'm not sold on this team. I know they did well. It's a great bowling attack, but none of them can bat.
Well, I do think that they made quite a good couple of moves with in that last game. I thought having, obviously, you would say that it was a good move because both of them scored runs, but having Van der Dussen at 3 and Markram at 4 seemed to work really well because Markram is not an obvious number 4. He opened literally his whole career, I think he was saying, since he was 11 years old or something like that. So they moved him down to number 4
for the Punjab.
Yeah, so I think they moved him down earlier in the year. Then Punjab used him in the same role. Yeah. They signed him as a seemingly middle order player, and everyone was like, "This is one of those incredibly weird replacements where a team signs someone they don't know what his role is and hope that it goes okay." Whereas actually, it kind of seemed like he did pretty well he did well enough for Punjab in the second half of the IPL, and then had a pretty good World Cup. I don't know whether he was in. I think he was in the official team of the tournament. Read into that what you want to, but shows that he did pretty well at least. But yeah, it was a really strange side. You're right, because they kind of split the 5th bowler overs between Markram, who's an incredibly limited off spinner, and then Pretorius, who kind of bowled pretty well, but mainly coming on in the 16th over or something like that, and just randomly bowling some cutters and doing pretty well at the death. So yeah, it was a pretty weird team, and throughout I was kind of thinking, if only they had Tahir plus Morris plus De Villiers plus whoever.
Faf.
But then equally, Faf. But then equally they end with, as you say, go out. I think they were the first team ever to go out having only lost one game since the Super 10s or Super 12 started.
So Pretorius is one of the people that makes me think that this is not a great team. Like, his international records is currently better than his domestic record. At one stage, I don't remember if you remember, but he bowled a back-of-the-hand slower ball, and Dale Steyn said he doesn't even bowl that. And it was a half-tracker back-of-the-hand slower ball that I think I can't remember who it got out. It might have been Moeen or someone. It dismissed them. And then he did it again. And I couldn't tell if he was doing it on purpose, which was insane, but maybe, or if it was by accident. But the next ball, he did it again. Chris Wokes came in and I think flat batted it over like mid-off for 6. It was he did brilliantly, but what he was doing is unsustainable to keep them good. And also his batting, I think he's a very like at the franchise level below sort of IPL and PSL. I think he's a really really good player. But at the World Cup level in a semi-final, is he really the guy you want to be bowling 1 or 2 death overs? And if you lose 5 quick wickets in the 12th over, do you really want him coming out to bat? Like there's a lot going on with that team.
They were one of those really odd teams as well that sort of, you have a guy like Pretorius at number 7, neither really batting or bowling. I think he barely he faced something like 5 balls across the whole comp. But they're in this really weird spot where you have someone who's in as kind of like a hitting all-rounder mainly at number 7. But then because of the fact you have kind of, I think, 4 number 9 or 10s rather than anyone who can genuinely hit boundaries at the death. Like I don't really think maybe Rabada's okay at number 8, but it feels a bit toppy to me. So you can't really exploit that batting depth. Plus also, I don't know, Bavuma's obviously a tricky one because he's captain and you have to have a certain number of black players in the side for transformation reasons. He's not a natural T20 player. He's kind of done okay in a particular role, but he's not necessarily the easiest guy to fit into the side. I think it's a tricky team where you wouldn't really be able to define them as like a batting heavy team or a bowling heavy team or any distinctive style of play other than the fact that they're kind of like in Australia. They chucked a load of players on the pitch and hoped it worked, but probably had slightly less good players than Australia did.
Well, I mean, it did work, to be fair. They ended up with 4 and 1. It just,
yeah, true. Yeah, true.
They weren't that far away. All right, we're talking about tricky teams. India. So my strong thought is, so I've just said that South Africa had a 4 and 1 record, and I think that flattered them. I think India had a 3 and 2 record, and I think that was maybe not unfortunate, but I didn't think they were that bad a team at all. Their top order collapsed in 2 key games. They probably should have picked Siraj, and they don't have a world-class leg spinner that they trust at the moment. I think that those are all fair things. But essentially, you would not expect that top order to fail in 2 key games.
Yeah, I think if you were to re-simulate this World Cup, if you go back to October 23 and play the whole World Cup again with everything equal from where it was, except everything's now random again and, toss results go a different way or something like that, you'd probably still back India to reach the final more often than not, and definitely to reach the semi-finals almost every time. They had 2 really bad games, and that killed them because the way the group worked out, you could only lose 1. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think India is suddenly an awful team. And I was sort of thinking through it as well. I was at the Namibia game, which was one of the most incredibly weird sort of spectacles I've ever seen, where you had, obviously they'd sold loads of tickets in advance and everyone still came. So it was a full house for a completely dead game where I turned up, I think, 45 minutes before the toss and saw the Indian team bus put in at the same time. So I thought this doesn't necessarily suggest that they're taking it too seriously. But yeah, I was at that game and I was kind of thinking to myself, what can I write as an angle for this? And was thinking, can I say you don't want to pick Kohli for the next tournament or something like that? And then I was looking at it and thinking, you're playing a T20 World Cup in Australia. You definitely want Kohli. You probably want Rohit, given his record in Australia. I don't think they're actually going to change very much between now and the next World Cup. And obviously there are some things that you could say, clearly the fatigue factor is relevant. Clearly the fact that they lost 2 tosses is relevant. Maybe there is something where it's harder for Indian players to perform at international level because there's all this external noise and pressure on them. Maybe they picked a few of the wrong players. Like they kind of I didn't think Shami was a great pick. I didn't think Thakur was a great pick. I didn't think Jadeja was a great pick, but they weren't awful picks. They weren't enough that you should.
I can't believe you didn't think
Jadeja
was a terrible team. But I'm not even going to pick you up on that.
Well, no, I think he was a solid pick, but I think they kind of picked him as a bowler as much as anything.
Yeah,
it felt like, at least. I think if you were picking him as a hitter, different, but I think his bowling was not great.
I think if him and Hardik is a good 5th bowler.
Yeah,
fair. So I don't have any problem with that. But the funny thing is, you've just said that Shami's not a good pick, and I agree with you. And obviously, I think you said the Lord as well, so you get attacked in the comments. But
Yeah.
but the thing is that they didn't lose their games because of the bowlers, right? I think most
Yeah,
of the
yeah, they
worst
lost because
selections were in the bowling, and they didn't lose because of that. And if you think about it, for me and you, we probably think that their batting is too anchor heavy. And again, their
mm,
anchors didn't make any runs. So if they'd
yeah,
gone with the more showy batters, so that's why I find them. I find it really, really interesting. Like, I kept looking for like the obvious thing that said that this was a bad T20 team, and it's like I just don't think it is a bad T20 team. I think it probably is, in the top 4 or 5 teams, and they didn't make the semi-final. I also think we had no idea that Pakistan and New Zealand were going to be this good. Everyone said the other group was the group of death. It was not.
yeah,
India ended up in the group of death because I still believe that Pakistan, India, and New Zealand were 3 of the top 4 teams. I don't think Australia was in the top 5 team. In the top 4 teams when it comes to talent, which tells you how random all this sort of stuff is. All right, we've done them. Let's see if you can annoy some Pakistani fans. See, Pakistan is so weird. I almost ranked them ahead of New Zealand, despite the fact New Zealand made the final, and I still almost want to slip them up now. They are designed to bat slow and then go completely nuts at the end, right? And they're never going to be out of the game with their bowling, right? And it didn't work in one game. And and
yeah.
I saw people saying things like, Baba needed to do this, or you needed to score. And I was like, but it worked in every other game. Like, I'm not saying it's my strategy. It's not how I would want to play T20, but it worked in every other game except the one that they needed.
Yeah, it's tough. I wrote a piece after that semi-final where I tried to sort of look at Babar's innings and say, was this good? Was this bad? Where he got 39 off 34, I think, and was the slowest scoring batter in the game. And it was a little bit shades of Rahane 2016, but then equally, I don't know, he's kind of started similarly in, as you say, every game that they've ever played. When it works really well. He got out playing his something like 7th attacking shot, happened to find a fielder out of 34 balls. And they still got a score that they would have backed themselves to defend more often than not. They bowled really badly at the death.
Yeah.
And Hassan Ali dropped a really easy catch, and then Wade hit 3 sixes. So
It's also worth remembering that, like, a lot of people are saying, they did really well when the toss went their favor and whatever, and then the one game the toss didn't go their favor. Marcus Stoinis, I think it was in the 13th over, muscles a ball off, I think, Shadab Khan over mid-wicket, and he beats mid-wicket by about 1.5 feet over his head. And it was a desperation shot because Australia needed some runs at that stage, and they needed to put Pakistan a bit on the back foot for a second. That gets caught. Pakistan win that game by maybe 40 runs, right? Like, it's very possible that, you bring on the quicks, the 2 big quicks, and they run through the middle or low order, or Pat Cummins has to face spin. Oh dear, good luck. Pat Cummins facing spin, right? All those things are very possible. They had a very, very good tournament, and I'm not sure. My only thing is, if they're going to be that predictable, to allow for Aaron Finch to basically put all their 5th bowling overs in the first 10 overs, surely they have to just be a bit smarter. But if Bubba and Rizwan are going to average about 50 each, right? One of them has to be like, we have to just slog against Mitchell Marsh and
that was the thing. It was so weird as well because I feel like Rizwan actually played. I think I was looking through the numbers on it on the night because obviously Babar didn't play very many attacking shots. Rizwan played a load of attacking shots, but didn't hit many of them very cleanly partly because of the fact that he'd spent 2 nights in ICU and was clonked on the grill in the 12th over or something like that by Stark. And, it wasn't like he wasn't swinging. He genuinely was really trying quite hard, I thought, in that semi-final at least, to score pretty quickly. But just, circumstances meant that it was pretty tough for him to do it. What I do think about Pakistan, what does feel like a massive missed opportunity, is the fact that they have such a good record in UAE. They are a team very, very much set up to play at home, Freudian slip, but play games in UAE. So to have sort of had such a good tournament for so much of it and then make those small errors at the end, which cost them, they probably won't get as good a chance to win a T20 World Cup in the next 2 editions, maybe 3, depending on venues and stuff like that. So it does because of that feel like a massive missed opportunity. Equally, as you say, I don't think the fact that they lost that semi-final means they're suddenly a bad team or that their way of playing is fundamentally broken. It's not necessarily the way that, if I were going into franchise team, I wouldn't say pick two guys who score quite slowly and hope that everyone else hits, but you know, it could very easily have won them that World Cup. It just happened not to, because a lot of random shit happens in World Cups.
It is also worth noting, I think this is extraordinary, that this was very Asian conditions. Maybe it didn't spin, but certainly kept very, very low. We're in the UAE, and only one Asian team made it to the semi-finals, and none of them made it to the finals, which might say a little bit more about just how bad Sri Lanka is at the moment, and India just, struggling a little bit. But it's still phenomenal to me. New Zealand, I don't think enough has been made of the fact that in the final they didn't have access to Lockie Ferguson, and obviously Conway didn't play in that. We talked a lot about England injuries, and we'll talk about that in a little while. I still think that they got nothing in this tournament really out. Well, Allen didn't play. Phillips, I don't think, made any runs. Seifert played one game. I think that there's a lot that they could do. Their bowling is going to be around for the next tournament, so that's not going to be a problem for them. I do wonder, though, if they're ever going to be able to overcome for the fact that Santner and Sodhi are both set up to bowl to right-handers. And they, as far as I'm aware, unless Anton Devcic has suddenly had a late career surge, I'm not sure they have another, or even actually he spins it the same way as those two do. But they really need to find someone who could spin it the other way. Oh, no, it's what's his name, isn't it? The Dutch player, is he got New Zealand citizenship?
Oh, Ripper.
Yeah, he might be their best chance. But I mean, that is a huge flaw in what is actually a fairly decent team. The only other problem I can see in this team is that I think Neesham and Santner are probably both batting one spot too high. Like if you're doing a perfect team.
It was quite. They almost managed to get away with it though, because that England semi-final, England batted, I think Moeen and Milan faced something like 68 out of the 120 balls that England faced in that semi-final. And, Williamson, maybe he shouldn't have bowled Glenn Phillips for an over. It didn't go particularly well. And maybe he should have tried Santner at least against Moeen. But, Moeen scores quicker than spin against pretty much anyone. I don't know. I think they kind of got away with it because I thought Williamson in the semi-final captained really quite well and captained quite aggressively, because there was a point, I think from 14th over to 16th over, he brought back the three quicks, which wasn't the obvious thing to do, where he had Milne, Southey and Bolt each bowled an over then, which meant you had to have Sodhi and Neesham bowling one each in the final four. And it actually did work, because I think those three overs, I think there was 1-4, 1-6, and Southey got Milan out caught behind, which broke the partnership. And meant that on a pitch where it was clearly not that easy to start for anyone apart from Neesham right at the end when it was a little bit dewy. I think he captained pretty well in that game. I thought by contrast in the final, I thought he was a bit predictable, but equally, as we'll probably come on to when we talk about Australia, it's really, really difficult to know who to bowl when you have Warner and Marsh batting together, because they're this almost like a dream complementary pair where you have like Warner, who is short left-handed and really good against spin, and Marsh, who is tall right-handed and really good against pace. And if they're clever about the fact that they can just take a single here and there, then it's really hard to know what to do. I did feel it was a bit captaincy by numbers, because he just bowled the three quicks for 6 overs in the power play. Then he brought on the spinners. Then he brought on the sixth bowler. And it was a bit, maybe he needed to do something a little bit different, given they clearly needed to take 5 or 6 wickets to win that game. But yeah, I think... I don't know. I don't really know what I feel about New Zealand generally. I feel like they made some calls before the tournament that I thought were really sort of boring and negative, by not picking Munro, not picking Allen, leaving Milne in the reserve, stuff like that. But then equally, Mitchell had a really good comp as an opener. He scored 49 against India and 70 something against England. Then Milne, when he came in, was solid but not amazing, and didn't exactly prove that he should definitely have been in from the start, especially when you consider they would have ideally picked Lockie in that attack. Maybe Munro would have been a useful guy to have in the squad. Maybe he would have been especially in the final, they didn't have Conway, they didn't have a left-hander through the middle. Maybe he would have been useful, but I don't feel like those calls were massively wrong. I feel like New Zealand just kind of did the New Zealand thing, where they have a group of quite solid players. They scheduled quite cleverly last summer. They played a ton of T20 cricket. They got guys like Southey and Bolt, who hadn't played, well, Bolt more so had played more games, but Southey, for example, hadn't played a huge block of T20 cricket for a while, but he played something like 12 T20 internationals last New Zealand summer, gets a load of match practice. They kind of punch above their weight, the classic cliche that you throw around and say they're nice guys and say, doesn't Kane have a nice beard and all this stuff, and then lost because they kind of got bullied in the final by Australia. So yeah, I don't really know what I make of this New Zealand team. I don't think it's a team where I don't look at it and think, oh yeah, they're definitely going to win the next one, but then I didn't think they were going to win this one, and a couple of things go their way in the final, or they weren't that far off winning the final. If they batted a bit more with a bit more intent right at the start and take a couple of Australian wickets, which is doable, and if Lockie's fit and that sort of thing, they could easily have won this one. So yeah, I don't know. They're just a weird team. I don't really know what to think about them.
Does Martin Guptill play in the next tournament?
If I'm picking the team, probably not.
I mean,
I think he probably will.
He's so hard to drop, but at the same time, they've got other guys who look. They won't. Obviously, he's got 3,000 international T20 runs and has played around the world, and it will be in Australia. Although there'll be a lot of left arm seamers as well. There's reasons to pick him, but you look at their team at the moment and you're like, God, if Mitchell could just bat like Mitchell, which is going to be bombing the odd ball, striking it around 130 and being quite solid, would you not be better off to chuck one of the absolute loose units next to him and just see what happens? I'm not sure if their team's set up for that. If Neesham's going to have to bat at 6, which he probably will next tournament as well, they probably think we can't make that choice. But realistically, they could have a very, very different kind of team if they wanted to, and go about that. But it's fascinating to me whether the Guptill plays in the next tournament.
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm reluctant to say he definitely shouldn't, because I think Finn Allen, for example, you look at him and think he should be brilliant by the time the next World Cup comes around. He's got another season under his belt, which is massive at that age in his development. Equally, he's really similar to someone like Tom Banton, who has done incredibly well in domestic cricket, playing on tiny grounds and smashing pace and getting away with miss hits against spin. And it's really difficult to know whether that's going to translate well, whether his development's going to keep going as it has, whether it's going to completely stagnate because teams find him out and there's some massive weakness that we haven't quite clocked onto yet. So I'm reluctant to say Finn Allen must play and ditch Guptill at this point. I would, a year out, I would probably lean towards saying probably don't bother with Guptill.
I think,
but then equally, I wouldn't have picked Southey in this World Cup squad, and he was really good until Warner bullied him a bit in the final.
I think if it's me and I'm New Zealand, I just say to Martin Guptill, look, we're not saying you're not going to go, but we know exactly what you can do. Go out, play as much franchise cricket as you need. You keep yourself in position. We're just going to try Finn Allen between now and the World Cup, right? And we might only try for 10 games, and we might decide that there's no point replacing him. We bring you back. We might give him all the games, and then you might still get picked for the World Cup. But I think that is a conversation that needs to be had because if Finn Allen can be Finn Allen at the international level, this team is way better, right? I mean, it's a complete... At the moment, you're just like, okay, Mitchell's okay, but he's probably not going to kill us. Kane's not going to kill us unless he flips a switch. And, even that takes him a while generally to flip a switch. And Martin Guptill, not the player he once was. And occasionally, 1 in 4 times, he's still going to be Guptill probably and smash you in the head. But it's not the Guptill of, a few years ago where he did that consistently. That's the top 3 that you can handle. You put a fully functional Finn Allen, that is not an easy sentence to say, into that top 3. And suddenly it's completely different. So I think I have a better idea of New Zealand than you do, but it would be really interesting to see where they are for that next tournament. I'm assuming that Ferguson, Milne, and Bolt are their 3 seamers, and Ferguson basically helps them at both ends a little bit. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating what sort of changes. Anyway, whatever they do, they'll do at the last minute like they did with Mitchell. But England, okay. I've got them ahead of Pakistan and New Zealand based on the fact that they made the semi-final look like the best team, or at least equal best team with Pakistan, with 5 frontliners missing, which I think is phenomenal. And they probably haven't got, because they didn't make the final, no one really cares anymore. And I'm willing to say that they probably win the South African game. I know that's going to annoy people. They're obviously brilliant at understanding their depth chart, in that Chris Wokes basically wasn't playing T20 cricket and suddenly he's one of the best bowlers in the tournament. Death bowling has become the story, but you put Jofra back in that team, I'm not sure it matters as much. And I'm assuming Adil and Moeen will ride again to the next World Cup. That's their biggest problem, I think, when those two go. But up until now, still looks like a good team to me. I know it's old, and a lot of people are worried about the age. Still looks good to me.
Yeah, I would basically agree with pretty much everything you said. I think throughout the comp, my thought with England was that they could have, and especially in the semi final when they had the Roy injury, which made them make the choice, I think they should have picked an extra seam bowling all rounder. So in that semi final, I would probably have picked Willie. I might even have picked Curran rather than Billings. I don't think in and of themselves they would have made a huge difference at the death because I don't think either of them is a brilliant death bowler. Willie's a new ball bowler who can bowl an over at the death. Curran is a death bowler who has been found out quite a lot. But I think that what they could have done if they picked those guys is made the rest of the attack more effective. So you wouldn't have ended up with Wokes bowling at the death because Wokes was brilliant with the new ball across the comp and he bowled 3 death overs in the comp, which went for 57 between them, which is, horrible. But and you don't want to suddenly criticize him for doing something that he has basically never done.
We saw Hazelwood go for runs at the death again, not a death bowler at this stage. Maybe never will be like Woke. So I think that's fair. I think that,
but I think the killer point though with this balance thing is that it's not going to be an issue next time because Stokes is almost certainly going to play. Sam Curran will be available. Archer can hit from down the order. They will have an extra. Mills will presumably. Well, you don't want to be too presumptuous with Mills's fitness, but there's a chance he's fit and able to play in a knockout game, for example. So suddenly you have a squad where balance isn't an issue, and the big question of should we go batter heavy, should we go bowling heavy? You can kind of be just a well-rounded team because you have 7 bowling options and a load of batting depth.
Yeah.
I agree. I think England were really good. I think they were pretty unfortunate with injuries. I think the semi was quite a weird game in a lot of ways because I felt like they did leave a little bit out there with the bat, but I don't think it was necessarily through lack of intent. I think it just didn't suit them as a pitch, didn't really suit their batting lineup. And then with the ball, obviously they bowled badly at the death, but equally New Zealand scored 57 runs, needed 57 runs in 4 overs, which no one had ever done before in a men's T20 international, and did it in 3, which is kind of one of those freak things where you kind of, there's a risk of over-analysis if you say England are some terrible team and they're all past it because they lose a game like that.
I think that goes back to the Australian-Pakistan game as well. To be 5 wickets down for that long, knowing that you only have, you have Pat Cummins and Mitchell Starc to swing at the end. You have to be realistic here that Pakistan and England were incredible teams throughout this tournament. And then at the end, they got, some for their own fault, some through injury, some through just happens. You could put all of the guys, you could put Mitchell and Neesham and Wade and Stoinis out in that situation again, and they hit the second ball straight up in the air. Because this is such a silly tournament, we overemphasize all these things. Whereas I still think that England and Pakistan are really good. I don't think England are as good as they were in the golden generation where they can bat down to number 9, 10, and 11. I don't think they have that in them anymore. But, there's so much talent there. And as you said, I think they might be a better... When because of Jofra almost on his own, I just think they're a better bowling lineup now than they were at that sort of peak period before. But I also wonder if this is the one that they were ready for. Because I would have thought if England stuff up and Pakistan and India and I don't know, maybe Sri Lanka from nowhere make the final, you go, oh, this is the Asian final, right? Maybe that's just what happens. But the fact that the 2 other teams were the Western teams, if I was at England, I'd just be like, damn it, this was a chance to, And there's no way, and we'll go into Australia right now, but there's no way of saying that either New Zealand or Australia are better T20 teams than England when fully fit. You can argue that Australia might have more talent in sort of certain areas, and New Zealand might be led better and have a really better bowling attack and batting compared and all those sorts of things. But realistically, I think England's a better team. But let's finish with Australia. It's absolutely pointless. Oh wait, I'm just going to get my daughter. I'll be back in 1 sec.
No problem.
A few moments later.
Let me put my headphones back on. God, if you lean there, then I can put them on. So look, there's Matt. If you can just look at Matt and laugh at him. and we'll finish this podcast.
How old is your daughter?
She's 1.5.
Nice.
All right. Do you want any milk? No. Okay, you look at Matt then. He's like a cartoon.
She just wants to laugh at me. It's all good.
I feel like it's almost pointless at this point to do analysis on Australia because it doesn't matter. They're just going to turn up at the next tournament with a bunch of people that are talented, and it'll either work or it won't work. It probably won't work next time, and it probably won't work for the next couple of tournaments. Then they'll win another one, and it won't matter. My interest is they've won this almost accidentally at a certain point, right? And a lot of things came together, like the whole Mitch Marsh thing. I don't think Mitch Marsh was ever in their plans. Marcus Stoinis went off to the IPL. Matthew Wade worked at number 7, right? You know, all these, Zampa's probably had almost the best player in the tournament, right? All these different things that's happened. Is there a possibility, though, that this actually makes Australian cricket go, we've got some players now, we can do some stuff going forward? Or do you think they won't do that and they'll just go back to being we'll just pick some good players and maybe it'll work?
I've absolutely no idea. It's the whole Australia thing is so funny because of, as you say, it's kind of like a mix of some things that looked like a plan and some things that happened to go well and some things that fell into place. And yeah, because there was a part of it, I did this piece before the final on Australia's sort of long/medium term vision with T20 and sort of what had happened and the fact that they were number 1 for a bit when Langer was committed to basically making them like a different version of Perth Scorchers from when he used to coach them in the BBL, and they still had Agar at 7 and they had a 5-bowler team, and then he just kind of changed it and it worked, and they won a World Cup basically because they won 4 games in a row because they batted down to number 7. And Wade has always been an opener. They've tried him a few times at like 4 or 5 and he's faced a load of spin and it's been awful. So they just thought, oh, well, if we bat him at 7, he probably won't actually have to face much spin. And then in the semi, he faces 1 ball of spin, which is a dot, and faces 16 balls of pace, which go for 41, and he wins in the game. So, and then I was thinking about, as you mentioned, Stoinis in the IPL. Has the IPL been good for them? Well, yes, in a way, because Stoinis had that experience as a finisher. Hazelwood and Cummins, I don't know, would they care as much about T20 cricket if they couldn't earn quite a lot of money from going off and playing in the IPL? Would they improve as much? Probably not.
I think Cummins always cared. I remember meeting Cummins when he was really young and having a chat with him, and I got the feeling that he really liked T20 cricket. Like him and his friends, they're all big cricket nerds, him and his friends, and he was talking about stuff. Hazelwood clearly didn't. Right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. He didn't play. Was it 3 games in 5 years or something? It's ridiculous.
He wasn't playing it. He wasn't interested, and so it's fair. So yeah, the whole thing is really interesting, and how they go about. And also, Australia have turned up in a lot of tournaments with 7 batters before, right? They've done it in one-day World Cups and all sorts of things. It's very rare though that their batters are off the chain. The thing I thought that was different this time is that they just basically said to their batters, look, go out there and hit the ball. Because Mitchell Marsh is not even a frontline batter, right? Like, I mean, he's he's almost like a pinch hitter in this role. Saying to him, mate, just hit the ball hard. The ball, if it's fast, hit it hard. If it's slow, turn it around for 1. And if you feel like slog sweeping, have a slog sweep. That isn't even the team that I saw start the tournament. Remember, against South Africa, they were just 125, and they were batting like grandmas, man.
Marsh got 11 off 17 in that game. It actually stood out how weird an innings it is. You have a guy who's, as you say, basically a pinch hitter, and he comes in and gets 11 off 17.
I feel sorry to grandmas. They were worse than that. They were so bad in that game. It turns out that was the only game they were going to lose. But yeah, I just thought that they seemed to just say to their batters, go for it, which I think is a much better... If they did that every time, with the amount of talent that is going to come out of Australian cricket, I kind of feel like they probably would, even without planning and doing things right, they'd probably just win slightly more tournaments. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it was really one of the things that I found really funny actually was when Langer was talking after the semi-final against Pakistan and basically saying, look, we just told everyone to be really aggressive, and the fact that Stoinis hit that 6 that actually you mentioned earlier off Shadab, I think was the ball after Shadab's 4th wicket. So he was kind of using this great example of the fact that Shadab took 4 for 25 or something like that because of the fact that they kept top edging sweeps up in the air, and he could very easily have had 5 for 20 if Stoinis' 6 had not cleared him. But he was like, oh yeah, it was great, we were all aggressive and positive. And I was like, well, this is kind of massively random, but yeah, equally They got smashed by England, decided that they weren't going to bother with Agar and were going to go all in on bat deep and kept on chasing. And you can kind of, I don't know, I feel as though you can probably utilize batting depth more when you're chasing. Because you have that cushion and sort of you don't have to be second guessing what you need to be going for. I think it's easier when you have a target in mind and when you're sort of guessing what par is and adding 15 to it or whatever you think you need to. It was all pretty weird. But then they absolutely smashed New Zealand in the final. Back to the IPL thing as well. Warner, in a way, was helped by the fact that he didn't play in the IPL and wanted to stick two fingers up at everyone. But equally, it wasn't great prep, the fact that he was not playing and was sat in the stands in Dubai waving that flag. And
oh my God, I had forgotten about that flag.
Which was like, just an iconic image at the time of Warner's decline in a picture. And then suddenly, 6 weeks later, something like that, he's man of the tournament in the World Cup. So, none of it made a huge amount of sense, but I don't think they really care that much, and all got pissed and had a great time by the looks of things, and they're probably going to try and follow exactly the same thing next time, where they hope that they win a few series between now and then, but it's not the end of the world if they don't, because they'll chuck what they see as the 15 best players in Australia into the squad and hope that it wins them the next World Cup. And, it's probably a 1 in 6 chance it does. So
thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jarrod.